The United States hit a growth spurt after the Civil War. The slavery issue that had been tearing the country apart since the 1700s was settled. Now a united United States could take its place alongside other great world powers like Britain, France, Germany, and Japan. Subduing the North American continent was the first order of business. Native Americans were ethnically cleansed. Railroads were laid from coast to coast. Factories became the centers of huge cities. American people and products filled every territory between Maine and California. In 1867, the United States bought Alaska from Russia, making it the first American territory not connected to the rest of the country. American missionaries and business owners took increasing interest in Hawaii. Some Americans started calling for the U.S. to annex or add Hawaii to the United States. Every other country was doing something similar. Britain, France, Germany, and Japan were adding land to their empires too, and were doing so on a much grander scale. Their factories were producing more goods than their populations could buy. Taking over new land would provide new markets, or customers, to soak up those extra products. American factories were going faster than anyone else's, yet America was lacking when taking over markets. The United States would never be considered a great power until they built an international empire of their own. This was the philosophy of Theodore Roosevelt, who, in 1897, became Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President William McKinley. As a student of history, Roosevelt was impressed with the research of Alfred Thayer Mahan, who had just published his book, The Influence of Sea Power on History. Mahan believed empires were built with navies. The countries with the biggest and most modern navies could take land around the world. Countries with forward naval bases could protect their homelands while threatening lands elsewhere. As Assistant Secretary, Roosevelt pressed McKinley to expand the Navy and take forward naval bases. The most ideal place for a forward naval base would be in Hawaii, a Pacific kingdom between California and Asia. American missionaries and businessmen had already gained influence there. Annexing or adding Hawaii to the United States seemed like the logical next step to Roosevelt. Plus, if the United States didn't take Hawaii, Japan would. Roosevelt saw Japan as the U.S.'s main competitor in Asia. The U.S. had a duty to win this competition, not only for their sake, but for the sake of all humanity. Roosevelt believed the U.S. was the better country. We had democracy, we had ingenuity, and most importantly, we weren't Asian like Japan. Roosevelt saw the quest for colonies around the world as an effort of white European races to take over what he saw as inferior people. Colonization was a blessing for the people being colonized because it allowed whites to uplift them by teaching them civilization. As the poet Rudyard Kipling wrote, it was the white man's burden to civilize other races. We couldn't let Japan beat us out of what was our rightful duty. It was also a matter of economics. As we said before, colonies provided markets, customers, to buy the surplus goods. This was a major reason why everyone wanted a piece of China. It was the most populous country on Earth, which meant lots of customers. By the time Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia had all gotten pieces of China, what were called spheres of influence, areas where only they could trade. Each country conducted business in its own sphere of influence and stayed out of each other's spheres. But the United States was left out. While other countries were gobbling up spheres of influence in China, the United States was focused on things like the Civil War and ethnically cleansing natives. By the time we were ready to join the China Party, it was too late. It was potentially fatal to the American economy, the fastest growing economy on Earth during the late 1800s. In 1899, William McKinley's Secretary of State, John Hay, tried to change the rules of the game in China by introducing the open door policy. It was a request that Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia give up their spheres of influence and let anyone trade with China, including the United States. This, of course, would benefit the United States the most. They would get a piece of the China market, and their factories were so prolific that they could sell goods for way less than any of those other countries. Hay claimed to care about China's ability to trade freely, but the other countries saw it for what it really was, a greedy attempt by the United States to change the rules of the game to benefit themselves. They happily ignored the open door policy and kept their spheres of influence. There was no way for the US to enforce the policy. We didn't have a navy. We couldn't make the international rules. In many ways, Britain made the international rules because they had the biggest navy. They were the first to get spheres of influence in China. They had the biggest empire in human history. Everyone was playing a game whose rules were established by Britain. If we wanted to make the rules, we needed a new navy. Roosevelt helped the US get that new navy. His pressure on President McKinley was starting to work. But after a little over a year as Assistant Secretary, Roosevelt resigned from the job to fight in the Spanish-American War. The war marked America's coming out party as a world power. Their victory gave them control of Spain's former colonies, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the biggest prize of all, the Philippines. The Philippines put the US right on China's doorstep and gave it control of land on both sides of the Pacific Ocean, giving them the edge over Japan. Shortly after getting the Philippines, President McKinley finally annexed Hawaii. The forward naval base the US would build there, Pearl Harbor, helped protect California, keep an eye on the Philippines, and compete with Japan as a Pacific power. Roosevelt's participation in the war helped make him a national celebrity, enough for him to become McKinley's vice president in 1901. A few months later, McKinley was assassinated, making Roosevelt the youngest president in American history. He was now in a position to lead America in its quest to become a world power, one that could set the international rules. He was put to the test immediately in the Philippines. Filipinos had been fighting Spain for independence for decades. They helped the United States during the Spanish-American War, assuming that an American victory meant independence for them. No doubt, the United States allowed them to think this. But once the war was over, the U.S. annexed the Philippines for themselves. Filipinos, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, continued to fight for independence against the United States. The Philippine-American War had begun. It was a vicious war, with Filipinos fighting guerrilla style against American soldiers. The U.S. was not trained for guerrilla war, leading them to brutalize the Filipino people by exterminating entire villages and herding them into concentration camps. From the Filipino perspective, there was no difference between Spain and the United States, aside from the fact that the U.S. pretended it was doing them a favor by taking them over. There is no doubt that this is what Roosevelt believed. In his eyes, an Asian people like the Filipinos weren't ready to rule themselves. They needed American tutelage before they would be ready for independence. They needed to be taught civilization first. But were concentration camps civilization? Was the brutality meted out by American soldiers, much of it motivated by racism, civilization? The longer the war dragged on, the more President Roosevelt looked like a hypocrite, bragging about civilizing the Filipinos while massacring them. Roosevelt, always concerned with his public image, was sensitive to these criticisms. He disapproved of the actions of the army, but as president, he had to take responsibility for them. For Roosevelt, the only bright spot in the Philippines was the American governor, William Howard Taft. Taft used what was called a policy of attraction in the Philippines, building schools and infrastructure to get the people on America's side. Yet Taft had little control over the army. All of the good things he tried to do were outweighed by the atrocities the army committed. No policy of attraction was going to paper over it. In July 1902, Roosevelt was forced to end the war in the Philippines. Midterm elections were coming up. Republicans were fighting for control of Congress. The longer the war went on, the more dead bodies piled up, the more that Roosevelt's Republican Party would get the blame, and Roosevelt himself would look like a fraud. The Philippine Organic Act ended the war and set up an elected assembly where Filipinos can make laws for themselves while remaining part of the U.S. empire. It allowed Roosevelt to keep control of the Philippines while also giving them a measure of autonomy. This quasi-colony status lasted until 1946, at which point the Philippines received full independence. The United States was finally a big dog in the Pacific yard, but it was a yard filled with big dogs, including Russia and Japan. In 1904, these two dogs fought the Russo-Japanese War. The bone they were fighting over was Manchuria, a region in the northeastern part of China. Few people believed that the small Chihuahua that was Japan could beat the massive Rottweiler that was Russia, but Russia got cooked. Their entire fleet at Port Arthur was wiped out. Then their entire Baltic fleet was defeated after sailing halfway around the world. Russia was beaten so badly that it caused a revolution that nearly toppled the Tsar in 1905. Russia's defeat was a surprise to everyone, especially to Theodore Roosevelt. Japan, an Asian nation, decisively beat Russia, a European nation. It contradicted Roosevelt's assumptions about Asian cultures being backwards. Most importantly, Japan's victory strengthened its position in Asia, which Roosevelt took as a direct threat to the United States. While the war was still raging, Roosevelt invited representatives from Russia and Japan to meet with him at the New Hampshire town of Portsmouth for peace talks. He hoped to craft a peace treaty between the two countries that would limit what Japan could get out of the war. Roosevelt did not want Japan to gain control of Manchuria. Instead, Japan received the Liangdong Peninsula, the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and control of the South Manchuria Railway. It was still a victory for Japan, but not nearly as much as Japan would have received if Roosevelt didn't step in to prevent the Russian military from being annihilated. The Treaty of Portsmouth was a major victory for Roosevelt. He left Manchuria open, thereby upholding the open-door policy there that everyone had ignored up to that point. Getting in the middle of a great power conflict was a sign that the United States was becoming a great power of its own. He became the first president in U.S. history to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, even though his main goal was asserting U.S. interests. Japan ended up being unhappy with the result of the war, feeling shortchanged after such a big victory, and they blamed Roosevelt. Anti-American riots broke out in the streets of Tokyo. Japan's government took a turn towards fascism, eventually leading to an alliance with Hitler during World War II and the eventual attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The ink on the Treaty of Portsmouth was barely even dry when another issue threatened to drive Japan and the United States even further apart: immigration. Japanese immigration into the United States had been steadily increasing since 1898. That was the year the U.S. annexed Hawaii. Many Japanese workers had lived in Hawaii at the time of annexation. Now that Hawaii was officially part of the United States, those Japanese workers were legally able to migrate to other parts of the U.S. Most of them came to California. California had been down this road before. During the late 1800s, Chinese workers who had come into the state faced discrimination from the white working class who thought they were stealing jobs. This helped lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned all immigration from China. Japanese immigrants faced a similar situation. San Francisco School Board approved the creation of Asian schools to segregate Japanese and Korean children from whites. Japan's government, already angry at the United States for the Treaty of Portsmouth, was outraged at the racism of San Francisco's school board. Roosevelt was outraged as well. He didn't want to give Japan any more reason to be upset with the United States. He also didn't think what the school board did was morally right. For all of his racial assumptions, Roosevelt believed that once immigrants were here in the U.S., they were entitled to the same rights as anyone else. He pressured California's leaders to ease up on the racism. At the same time, he worked behind the scenes with the Japanese government to prevent more Japanese from coming into the U.S. These are the roots of the so-called Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. Japan would discourage their people from entering the United States, while California agreed not to formally discriminate against Asian immigrants. Roosevelt successfully eased tensions with Japan, but they would flare up later as the competition between the countries heated up